So the study that I want to talk about today was a participant observation and qualitative interview-based study in a hospice in New South Wales. It involved spending 6 months with a whole range of different people who were dying at the end of life, some within days, some within weeks of the end, all of whom had cancer, and it involved me spending time with them day to day, having informal conversations, but also recording structured interviews and talking to them about everything from the experience of coming into the hospice, their experiences I guess in the last few weeks of life, and for some of them days, and covered everything from the existential issues around where they felt they were going, if anywhere, to suffering, to wanting to survive and persist, and so forth, and many difficult but also really enlightening conversations about that end of life period. And of particular interest, I guess, in terms of what I'm talking about today, is how men in particular experience that very challenging but very important period of the last few days and weeks of life, and the role of masculinity or gender roles and biographies in that process. We didn't really have an understanding of how these normative frameworks around masculinity shape the experience of the end of life. Some of these normative ideas, let's call them, I guess, aspects of hegemonic masculinity, include such things as stoicism, strength, and the whole range of what you might call normative values of what it means to be a man. And we all know that these don't hold up in practice. We all know that we resist, or to some extent we resist these things. However, they still to an extent offer normative pressure on us as subjects of the world. Now, in the context of going into a hospice and being an inpatient in a hospice and dying in a hospice, you can imagine, perhaps, as the men told me, how that would offer considerable challenges to their previous identities as men. We're going into a context of high dependency. We're going into a context where it may feel, from a bodily perspective, and even from a mind perspective, that one has relatively little self-determination. You're highly dependent on the support care of others. And because of that, these normative features of the world around what it is to be a man no longer become viable. It's almost as if the components of who we are slowly, I guess, flitter away. And it relates to the broader idea of the social death, which is the end of life. Death starts before we die. It starts with the, I guess, dissipation of forms of our identity or parts of our identity. Now, for men, I would argue, as a result of this work, part of that social death can be, not for all men, but for some men, a loss of sense of self, of what it is and what it has been to live as a man, a father, and the other roles that some men occupy in our society. The point that's often emerges in other research areas, which is the idea of men as kind of the epitome of strength, and so forth, also emerged in this study, where men talked about, that they were, and I quote from one man who said that they were a solid brick for their community, and yet when they came into the hospice, they could no longer occupy that role. So actually, the dying process for that particular person was, or the grief that he was experiencing and the suffering that he was experiencing, was very much situated within his sense of loss of the person, the man that he was before coming into the hospice and before embarking on his end-of-life journey. I guess the take-home message from this study was that some men experience key challenges at the end of life in relation to their gender identities, and that we need to think very carefully about how end-of-life processes and end-of-life care accommodates the sense of grief and loss that can occur, that's particular to gender roles and identities.